I was 15 when it happened. It was a Friday night in late September, the air just starting to turn cold where I lived. My parents had gone out to dinner with some family friends and told me they wouldn't be home until late, leaving me with the house to myself. I invited my neighbor and best friend, Chris, over. He was my age and lived right across the street. Usually, we'd hang out in the basement, playing games or watching movies, but that night we got bored. Eventually, he suggested playing hide-and-seek. It sounded childish at first, but we had done it before with a group, and it had been fun. The house wasn't big, but it had plenty of hiding spots, especially in the dark. We turned off most of the lights to make it creepier, leaving only the kitchen light on. The rules were simple, no going outside, and no entering the attic or crawl space. Everywhere else, basement, bedrooms, closets, under furniture, was fair game. Chris wanted to hide first, so I covered my eyes in the living room and counted to 50. I heard him running at first, then silence. When I finished counting, I announced that I was coming. I started with the kitchen, but there wasn't anywhere to hide there. I checked behind the basement door, then down the hall. The bathroom was empty. I opened the closet near the front door, nothing. I went upstairs, the floor creaking under me, every sound making me tense. I searched my parents' room first, looking under the bed and behind the dresser. Nobody. Then I moved to my room. It was messy but not enough for Chris to hide. Still, I checked the closet and under the desk, nothing. The only place left was the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open. I pushed it slowly, expecting him to jump out and scare me, but the room was quiet and dark. I stepped inside, scanning around. I bent to look under the bed, nothing. I opened the closet, empty. I figured he must be in the basement, so I went back downstairs. I checked behind the laundry machines and the storage space under the stairs. I was about to give up when I finally found him curled up behind some boxes. He laughed and asked how long it had taken me. I told him way too long. Then we switched. He counted while I hid. I went upstairs and slid under the guest bed, pulling the bed skirt down to cover myself. My heart raced in the dark. A few minutes later, I heard him come upstairs, his footsteps slow and heavy. He opened the bathroom door first, then stepped into my parents' room. After a while, I heard him in the hallway, moving closer to where I was. I could hear his breathing as he entered the guest room. He stopped near the bed. I held my breath. His shoes shuffled softly against the carpet, then silence. A long silence. I thought he was about to pull up the bed skirt, but instead, he walked out. I waited a few minutes, expecting him to call that I'd won, but the house stayed quiet. Finally, I crawled out and went downstairs, expecting to find him on the couch, but he wasn't there. I called out that the game was over, and a voice came from the basement saying he was down there. I thought he was joking. I walked to the basement door, opened it, and shouted down. He shouted back that he was still looking for me and asked where I was hiding. My stomach twisted. I told him I was upstairs now, standing in the kitchen. A moment later, he came up the stairs into the light, looking confused. He asked how I'd gotten upstairs so fast. I told him I'd been under the guest bed the whole time. He frowned and said he was sure he had checked that room and heard someone moving inside, breathing, even. I told him I had stayed completely still. We argued a little but eventually laughed it off. We played another round, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every creak in the house made me jump. Once, while I was counting, I thought I heard something upstairs, like a soft thud, but when I checked, the rooms were empty. I found Chris hiding in the laundry room. We played until we were tired, then sat on the couch and turned the TV back on. That's when we froze. From upstairs came a loud thump, like something heavy falling. Chris asked if it was my parents, but I reminded him they weren't home yet. The hair on my arm stood up. We sat there listening, but the house went quiet again. Chris said maybe something slid off a shelf. I wanted to believe that, but then we both heard it, the slow creak of floorboards, footsteps moving down the hallway upstairs. We stared at each other, too afraid to move. I whispered that maybe we should check. Chris shook his head, saying no way, but if someone had broken in, we couldn't just sit there. I told him to stay behind me and grab the fireplace poker from beside the couch. We crept up the stairs, the house so quiet I could hear my breathing. The steps groaned beneath us. At the top, I pointed toward the guest room. The door was now closed. I knew I'd left it cracked open. We froze. Then came a sound from behind the door, a slow dragging noise, like fabric sliding across the carpet. Chris whispered that we should leave. I wanted to, but fear and curiosity held me there. My hands shook as I raised the poker and grabbed the knob. I pushed the door open fast. The room was dark, but I could see the outline of the bed and dresser. No one was there. The closet door was half open. I approached it while Chris stayed in the doorway. I yanked it open, just coats and boxes inside. We both let out shaky laughs, trying to pretend it was all in our heads. Then, just as we turned to leave, we heard another sound, this time downstairs. The front door opening and closing. We froze again. Chris whispered that someone was in the house. My stomach dropped. We ran down the hall and crouched in my room with the lights off. I gripped the poker tightly. At first, there was silence. Then faint footsteps sounded on the first floor. I wanted to call the police, but my phone was still on the couch. I whispered that maybe we could sneak out the window, but it was too small. The only way out was past the stairs. The footsteps grew closer. We heard the basement door open, then slow steps descending. We exhaled in relief, whoever it was had gone down. We sprinted down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they called the police. Officers searched my house top to bottom but found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no one hiding anywhere. They said it was probably the house settling or our imaginations running wild, but Chris and I both knew what we heard. Someone had been inside. For weeks afterward, I could barely sleep. Every creak made me think someone was in the hall. That was the last time I ever played hide-and-seek. We were too old for it anyway. Chris and I never really talked about it again, but sometimes, when we look at each other, I can tell we're both remembering that night, the night hide-and-seek turned into something else. Even now, years later, I still think about the sound of that closet door, the dragging across the carpet, and the footsteps on the first floor. We never found out who it was. Maybe a burglar who realized we were still home. Maybe someone who slipped out when we ran. All I know is that playing hide-and-seek that night taught us how terrifying it is to realize you're not alone in your own house. Then, just as we turned to leave, we heard another sound, this time downstairs. The front door opening and closing. We froze again. Chris whispered that someone was in the house. My stomach dropped. We ran down the hall and crouched in my room with the lights off. I gripped the poker tightly. At first, there was silence. Then faint footsteps sounded on the first floor. I wanted to call the police, but my phone was still on the couch. I whispered that maybe we could sneak out the window, but it was too small. The only way out was past the stairs. The footsteps grew closer. We heard the basement door open, then slow steps descending. We exhaled in relief, whoever it was had gone down. We sprinted down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they called the police. Officers searched my house top to bottom but found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no one hiding anywhere. They said it was probably the house settling or our imaginations running wild, but Chris and I both knew what we heard. Someone had been inside. For weeks afterward, I could barely sleep. Every creak made me think someone was in the hall. That was the last time I ever played hide-and-seek. We were too old for it anyway. Chris and I never really talked about it again, but sometimes, when we look at each other, I can tell we're both remembering that night, the night hide-and-seek turned into something else. Even now, years later, I still think about the sound of that closet door, the dragging across the carpet, and the footsteps on the first floor. We never found out who it was. Maybe a burglar who realized we were still home. Maybe someone who slipped out when we ran. All I know is that playing hide-and-seek that night taught us how terrifying it is to realize you're not alone in your own house. The steps stopped not far from me. Whoever it was just stood there. I waited for them to move again, but they didn't. The hairs on my arms stood up. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but I remembered the rules. If I gave myself away, I'd lose, so I stayed still. Finally, the footsteps started again, crunching deeper into the woods. I listened until the sound faded, then peeked over the log, but it was too dark to see much. The moonlight only lit the tops of the trees. I stayed hidden a few more minutes before getting tired of waiting. I crawled out and started making my way back toward the yards. As I walked, I heard Jason calling that the round was over. I hurried back and found the others already gathered in the yard. Jason had found Tyler and Eric, but not me or Matt. A minute later, Matt came running out of the woods, covered in dirt, laughing that nobody would have found him. I told them I'd been behind the log and almost got caught when Jason walked past me, but Jason frowned and said he never went that far into the woods, he'd only circled near the first trees before finding Tyler. I stared at him, confused, then asked who it was that had walked by me. Everyone just shrugged. We brushed it off and started another round. This time I was it. I counted loud against a tree while everyone scattered. When I finished, I searched the yards first. I found Eric hiding behind a shed and Tyler crouched in some bushes. Then I headed into the woods to look for Jason and Matt. The forest was quiet except for the bugs. My flashlight beam swung across the trunks as I listened for movement. Eventually, I spotted Matt crouched by a tree and shouted that I'd found him. He laughed and ran back toward the yard. That just left Jason. I searched deeper, calling out that I was coming, and that's when I heard it again, the slow, heavy footsteps moving in the dark ahead of me. I aimed my flashlight, but the trees were too dense. I walked carefully, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. I froze, waiting, a nervous chill creeping down my spine. Then, suddenly, I heard Jason calling from behind me that the round was over. I spun around to see him walking back to the yard. Confused, I asked if he'd been ahead of me, but he said no, he'd been hiding close to the house the whole time. My stomach tightened. Twice now, I'd heard someone walking in the woods who wasn't one of us. I told myself it was probably an animal, but the steps had sounded too heavy, too deliberate. We played a few more rounds, but every time I hid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there with us. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and once, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, but when I shined my flashlight, nothing was there. The others didn't notice anything strange. They just laughed and kept playing, but I couldn't ignore the pit in my stomach. For the final round of the night, Jason wanted to hide in the woods again. We all split up like before. I didn't want to go too far, so I stayed near the edge, crouching in the tall grass where I could still see the faint glow of porch lights through the trees. I heard Jason's voice counting in the distance, and then silence again. After a few minutes, I heard something that froze me where I crouched, a whisper. A low, soft voice, too quiet to understand, but close. My whole body tensed. I peeked over the grass, but the woods were empty. The whispering stopped, replaced by slow, steady footsteps moving past me and deeper into the trees. I lay there trembling. Then Jason called that the game was over, and everyone came out laughing. I walked back slowly, my heart still racing, and told them I'd heard someone whispering. They all laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd heard. We sat in Tyler's yard afterward, drinking soda and talking, when Matt suddenly asked if anyone else had noticed the man. We all stopped. He said that while he was hiding, he'd seen a tall man standing in the woods, not moving, just watching. Jason told him he was imagining things. Eric laughed it off, but my stomach dropped because I believed him. We ended the night soon after, and everyone went home. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, hearing that whisper and those footsteps again in my head. I never played hide-and-seek in the woods after that. Even now, years later, when I hear leaves crunch underfoot in the dark, I think about that night, the footsteps that weren't Jason's, the whisper I still can't explain, and the man Matt said he saw. Maybe it was a stranger passing through. Maybe someone who lived out there. All I know is that when you hide in the dark woods, you never really know who else is hiding with you. It was a hot Saturday afternoon last July. I was 14 then, living out in the rural part of Pennsylvania. My backyard is huge, acres of open grass, trees, and an old storage shed sitting at the far edge. My friends and I spent nearly every summer day out there. That day it was me, Ryan, Josh, and Adam. We were messing around, playing basketball on the hoop my dad put up near the garage. After about an hour, we were all tired, sitting in the grass, sweaty and drinking water, when we saw a kid we didn't recognize walking up from the dirt road that runs past my house. He looked about 16, older and taller than us. His black hair was messy, and he wore a gray shirt and jeans, even though it was blazing hot. We stopped talking as he approached. He came right up like he already knew us and asked if we wanted to even out the teams and make it 3-on-3. None of us said anything at first. Finally, Adam asked who he was. The kid said his name was Keith, that he lived just up the road and had been walking through the woods when he spotted us. We all exchanged looks. I'd lived there my whole life and never seen him before, none of us had, but he seemed normal enough. Ben asked if he wanted to play basketball, but Keith shook his head and suggested we play manhunt instead. He said my yard was perfect for it, with so many places to hide. None of us thought much about that comment at the time, but looking back, that should have been a red flag. How would he know anything about my yard? Still, we agreed, it sounded more fun than standing around in the heat. We split into 2 teams. Keith immediately volunteered to be on the hunting team. He said he loved being the seeker, so it was him, Adam, and Josh hunting, while me, Ryan, and Ben hid. Adam kicked a soccer ball to start the game. We ran off while the hunters covered their eyes and counted. Ryan sprinted toward the tree lean and then behind the garage. I didn't want to go into the woods yet, so I went into the storage shed. It always smelled like gasoline and old wood. I found a pile of folded tarps in the corner, crawled under one, and lay still. I stayed there for what felt like forever, at least 10 minutes, and nobody came. I started to think they'd given up, but then the shed door creaked open. The tarp ripped off me in one quick motion. It was Adam, smiling. I guess I'd picked too easy of a spot. We both walked back to the patio. A few minutes later, Ben showed up, he'd been caught too. Soon after, Adam and Josh came back, laughing, but Keith wasn't with them. At first, no one said anything. Then Josh asked where he went. None of us knew. We waited another 10 minutes, figuring he'd turn up any second, but he never did. Adam finally shrugged and said maybe Keith was just some weird kid who left. We agreed, though it felt strange that he'd disappear without a word. When the others went home around sunset, I headed inside. That's when I noticed something odd near my bedroom window, a piece of rope lying in the grass. It was weathered and dirty, like it had been outside for months, but I knew it hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up and tossed it aside, trying not to overthink it, but Keith popped into my head anyway. Later that night, I couldn't shake the thought, what if he'd gone inside the house while we were distracted? My dad usually left one of the side doors unlocked during the day. I went through every room, checking closets and under beds, but found nothing. Around 11, I got ready for bed. I lay there scrolling on my phone for about an hour when I heard something, soft footsteps just outside my door. I froze. My dad sometimes got up at night, but he always coughed or cleared his throat. This was silent. Too silent. I called out for him. No answer. My pulse was racing. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I finally got up and locked it. I stood there, staring at the handle, waiting. After about 30 seconds, I heard the front door shut. The sound echoed through the house. I ran straight to my dad's room and shook him awake. Groggy, he sat up while I told him what happened. He didn't doubt me. He grabbed the shotgun from under his bed and told me to stay close. We searched the whole house together, every closet, the basement, the garage, and then he went outside, walking the property with a flashlight. Nothing. Afterward, we locked every door and window tight. The next day, I told my friends. They laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some weirdo passing through, but Ryan admitted he thought Keith was off, too. He said the guy barely talked during the game, just stared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, a scratching sound woke me. It came from my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the blinds. The noise was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging a stick or a nail across the glass. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I bent one of the blinds open just a crack, and there, inches away on the other side of the window, was a figure. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of someone standing in the dark. I jumped back and screamed for my dad. I bolted into the hallway shouting until he came out of his room. He didn't hesitate, ran outside with the shotgun and fired 2 rounds into the air. I heard him yell that he'd shoot whoever was out there if they came back. When he came inside, the figure was gone. Neither of us slept after that. We stayed up the rest of the night, lights on. The next morning, my dad told me he thought Keith had been the one messing with us. He said if that kid showed up again, he'd shoot him, half joking, but serious enough. He told me that kid wasn't welcome near our house ever again. As far as I know, Keith never came back. But sometimes, when I'm outside at night, I think about that rope by my window, and I can't help but wonder what he was planning to do if I hadn't woken up when I did.